An introduction to pathophysiology. This is really a very superficial review of some of the things you've had in previous classes that you're going to need to remember for this class. First thing has to do with movement of particles and water across concentration gradients. That's diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Diffusion is the movement of particles, also called solutes, from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. It evens out the concentration. Quite often we're talking about movement of these things across a membrane, a semi-permeable membrane within the body. But here's an example of diffusion just within a glass of water. As you watch, you see the original drops of food coloring are very concentrated, but they spread out, they diffuse, until if we waited long enough, the entire glass would be filled with liquid of the same color. On the other hand, osmosis has to do with the movement of water across a membrane from an area of low concentration to high concentration. The area on the left is very low concentration. There's lots of water, not much solute. The area on the right doesn't have as much water compared to the amount of solute. So the water moves. So you'll end up with more water in the compartment on the right, but the concentration of the two liquids is the same. Remember, water follows the solutes, or water follows the salt. If there's a high concentration of a solute, such as salt, in a compartment, water is going to move to dilute it. That's why we get thirsty after going on a salty snack binge of potato chips or popcorn, that kind of thing. The last concept in this section is active transport. Whereas osmosis and diffusion has to do with evening out the concentration, this one has to do with making the difference between the two greater. It's taking the particles from an area of low concentration and moving them into an area of higher concentration. Think of this as blood sugar. We need to take it out of the blood and move it into the tissues. Even though we're not evening out the concentrations, the tissues is where that sugar is needed. It doesn't need to stay in the blood. So, as I said, you end up with an area that's getting more and more concentrated and an area or a compartment that's getting less and less concentrated. We're increasing the difference in the concentration. This process requires energy. It's not something that passively happens. It requires energy to move something from an area of lower concentration to higher concentration. Our next section has to do with metabolism. Metabolism is really a combination of two different processes, catabolism and anabolism. Now, catabolism is the disintegration or the breaking apart of complex molecules. And by doing that, energy is released. Okay, somebody eats food. That's a fairly complex molecule. It's broken down into glucose, and part of that process is the release of energy, and which is then stored as ATP. Anabolism is the reverse. It's the reorganization. It's the rebuilding. It's the process for growth and repair of body tissues on the cellular level. It's taking the stored energy, the stored glucose, and using it to build other systems. Now we get energy from three major food sources. The first is carbohydrates. That's our main source of energy. That's what the body likes to use. It's what the body uses easiest. However, if no carbohydrates are available, the body is going to move to using lipids or fats. And finally, we eat proteins, but that's really not an energy source unless everything else is depleted, and we're talking about major body wasting. Proteins are used primarily for growth, and enzymes within the body are proteins, and they are used to regulate body processes. Okay, anaerobic metabolism. We're talking about catabolism here, and that this is called glycolysis. It is energy production without oxygen. We're breaking down carbohydrates, and when we do this, we build up lactic acid within the body. This is what causes the muscle soreness when you run for a long time and you're not in shape. However, if we continue to use this anaerobic metabolism without oxygen, we're going to end up with metabolic acidosis. So this is really for short-term energy. It's not for it's not a source, a good source of long-term energy. Aerobic metabolism, again, that's a form of catabolism. We call that the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Energy is produced. It does use oxygen to do this. And this is what is used for long-duration activity. And this process can keep going until the carbohydrate sources are depleted within the body. Stress, injury, and aging of cells. Okay, we put some kind of stress to a cell. The cell is either going to adapt or it's going to be injured. If the cell adapts, it continues to function normally. However, if the cell can't adapt and ends up being injured, we're not going to have normal functioning. Something's going to be going on, but it's not normal, and we may end up with cell death. Cells adapt by either atrophying, they shrink in number or size, they hypertrophy, they get bigger. Hyperplasia, that means we make more and more cells to try and cope with this stress. Or we have dysplasia, which is a change in form. The cells become abnormal. How do we injure cells? Well, first we can just not feed them. That's hypoxia or a nutritional deficit or imbalance. We're not feeding the cells in either one of these cases, and they will become injured. Or cells can be exposed to damaging agents, such as too much heat or too much cold, radiation, electricity, chemicals, biological agents. Cells can die. The first way is apoptosis, which is called cell suicide. It's a normal process. Cells are pre-programmed to live a certain amount of time, and there's also messages sent out by other structures in the body to say, okay, we don't need all you guys anymore, some of you can die off. It's the way the body gets rid of old, worn out, and unwanted tissues. The second way cells die is called necrotic cell death. It's not a normal process. The body is getting rid of injured cells, and quite often the cells around them, around the ones that are dying off, are experiencing inflammation. This would be the necrotic cell death. We're talking about injured cells, cells that have been injured, frostbite, burns, radiation, chemical or biological damage, or tissue trauma.